Hey there, kids. It isn't rewriting history, but your LoreDad, here with my first collaboration. Rewriting and I got in contact and decided to do 2 videos with a similar premise, and discuss our takeaways. For this collaboration, we decided to do a scenario where Turkey joins the Second World War. Rewriting will be focusing on an allied Turkey, while I will be focusing on an Axis Turkey. I'm really excited to get into this, and I hope that you check Rewriting History's video on the topic after you finish my video, if you haven't already. With that being said, let's get into it. During the Second World War, the Soviets had put immense political pressure on Turkey to stay neutral, and the Axis and allies had invested heavily into Turkey's development. The major powers of the war wanted Turkey on their side. This is because of Turkey's incredible geopolitical position, especially during the Second World War. With its proximity to the Levant, the Axis wanted to be able to use this border to sweep in and seize British oil. Their border with the Soviet Union was also a major advantage, as with Turkish aid during Barbarossa, it would have been possible to potentially seize Baku, the largest oil-producing sector in the Union at the time. The Allies had sought Turkey's alignment for their front in the Balkans. With the aforementioned border with the Levant, the Allied soldiers would be able to simply march to establish a land front with the Axis. This, and Turkey's control of the Bosphorus Straits, could function as a direct naval route to support the Soviets during Operation Barbarossa. But despite the Axis and Allies' best attempts, Turkey had remained neutral, at least until the very end of the conflict, joining the Allies 6 months before Berlin had fallen to the Soviet Union. But why? In order to answer this question, we need to learn more about Turkey's history. Following the Ottomans' capitulation after the First World War, the Treaty of Sèvres had attempted to carve out the entirety of the Ottoman Empire. However, Mustafa Kemal had organized a resistance to the troops that had been deployed by the Entente to secure these land transfers. Under Kemal's leadership, Turkey's independence was secured, and he would oversee reforms that would ensure the Turks would enter the modern era, eventually leading to him getting the title of Ataturk, meaning Father of the Turks. Under Ataturk's leadership, he would promote secularization, liberalization, republican, and several democratic reforms, with the intention of establishing a multi-party democratic republic. But the most important tenet to overcome in this timeline would be Ataturk's commitment to pacifism. Ataturk's quote of "peace at home, peace in the world" explains the ideology very firmly. The desire to have peace must be demonstrated inwards, in order to avoid the atrocities of war to perpetuate. For this reason, when Ataturk retired and was succeeded by İsmet İnönü, he would continue this policy. Therefore, the greatest hurdle we need to overcome in order to create a plausible timeline where Turkey joins World War II, we would need to change Ataturk's successor to be a more German-aligned politician. This is where our alternate successor comes in. Recep Peker, a self-professed fascist, but a member of the Republican People's Party. If he were to become Ataturk's successor, it would ensure Turkey's stability and practically guarantee their pro-Axis alignment. While a pro-German president seems like more than enough in order to facilitate an Axis alignment, we still need to determine what Turkey would exactly get out of joining the Axis, rather than staying neutral like in our timeline. Much like how the Nazis had professed a pan-Nordicism, there were many organizations in Turkey which advocated for the founding of a pan-Turkic state, Turan. This hypothetical state would claim the Turkic communities along Central Asia. However, Kemal had denounced any sort of pan-Turanism within his ideology, therefore making such movements ill-advised. However, this wouldn't mean that Turkey would not want to expand. Turkish nationalists would seek to claim territories of significant strategic interests, like Cyprus, and seek to expand further southwards in order to gain direct control of vital resources. For example, Turkey was heavily influenced by Britain due to the British dominance over Iraqi oil, which was Turkey's primary source, dependent on friendly trade. Seeking to strive for self-determination, they would claim these territories to secure the oil for themselves. An Axis-leading Turkey may even seek to claim Azerbaijan, and of course, the rest of Armenia. Because Germany was deliberately seeking to conquer the east as a means to ensure resources for themselves, they would also claim Azerbaijan as well. In order to alleviate this conflicting claim, the Germans would propose measures such as co-ownership of the resources, but would have no intention of actually fulfilling these hypothetical promises, as Germany had strived for autarky. Regardless of the eventual outcome, the Germans would recognize Turkish claims in an attempt to sway them further to the side of the Axis. As mentioned earlier, Turkey's oil supply came from trade with Iraq, a British-aligned state. Therefore, any attempts for Turkey to join the Axis would lead to their economy quickly vanishing. However, an incredible opportunity would arise for Turkey to join the Axis without any of the aforementioned downsides: the Golden Square coup of Iraq. In our history, after the Axis had made significant gains in the North African campaign, an Iraqi nationalist, Rashid Ali al-Gaylani, would execute the Golden Square coup in attempts to expel any and all British influence in the state, and began requesting aid from Germany and Italy. In response to this, the Allies had invaded Syria, which was technically under the control of Vichy France, in order to avoid the Axis from using the airfields to support the fascist Iraqi. This is an incredible opportunity for the Turkish to join the Axis. They would join it at a moment in time where the Allies were incredibly vulnerable, and the Axis had just begun their invasion of Yugoslavia in order to link up with the invasion of Greece. This would allow for Turkish claims on Greece to be obtained if they had joined in time. For these reasons, in this alternate timeline, Turkey would recognize Rashid's Iraq and join the Axis. Turkish troops, supported by other Axis members, would flood into the Levant, halting the Allies' attempts to capture Syria and provide extra assistance to the nationalist Iraqi, bringing them both under Turkish influence. By seizing the north of Iraq, the Turks managed to preserve their main supply of oil, and now for the Axis as well. In order to ensure that the Turkish would directly control the oil and not risk any sort of allied counter-coup, the Turkish would annex all Kurdish plurality lands within their Syrian and Iraqi puppets, proclaiming themselves the natural protector of all Kurds. With this incredible opportunity to seize the vital Suez Canal, Italy and Germany both would commit forces to this southern thrust, with the aim of quickly overwhelming the British and, hopefully, gain a ceasefire with Britain before Hitler would attempt to conquer his Lebensraum. But here lies the question: would this be enough to turn the tide of war to grant the Axis victory? I don't think so. British troops were formidable in Egypt. Even if they had not anticipated the Turkish entry and the Iraqi coup, the troops that had been committed to these operations would still be present in the region, so any amount of troop diversion would be minimal. Therefore, this would mean that the Germans and Italians would find it incredibly vital for their strategic interest to support this Levantine front in order to potentially destroy the Allies' will to fight. However, the Germans had to invade the Soviet Union for one major reason: oil. While the historical consensus regarding the exact motivations for the German invasion of the Soviet Union are up for debate, there is no doubt that the Germans were severely lacking oil to fuel their war machine. In order for the Germans to keep up their war effort, they needed to seize the Soviet resources in the east. It was so vital, in fact, that initial plans for Operation Barbarossa had been drafted to begin May 15, 1941, but had been delayed to June 22, 1941. Many consider this delay to have significantly affected the efficacy of the operation, and attribute the Yugoslavian and Greek invasions for its delay as a major factor towards a Soviet victory in the Great Patriotic War. Now imagine that after delaying the operation once, you are now stuck between either invading the Soviets in June 1941, or potentially waiting an entire year, as to not invade the Russians in winter, to attempt to secure the Suez prior to the invasion. The long-term gain of potentially securing all the Mediterranean prior to Barbarossa is too good to pass up. However, delaying the invasion by another year in its entirety would not be feasible. The Germans needed oil in order to keep up the war effort, let alone supply an entire invasion of the Levant. Securing Iraq for the Axis would help offset the oil problems, but not fix them. Therefore, I believe that the Germans would still execute Operation Barbarossa in this timeline at the same point of time as our history. Due to German desperation, they begin their invasion of the USSR. Despite the lower amount of troops, The Germans and their battle prowess would overwhelm the Soviets initially, but the advance into the main sectors of the USSR would be much slower, due to too many troops committed elsewhere. However, the introduction of Turkey into the Axis prior to Barbarossa has several benefits. Due to their strategic location, German bombers would have more range to destroy infrastructure and support the invasion. And with the direct land border of Turkey and the Soviet Union, the Turks, supported by other Axis troops, would attempt a large blitz to Baku. While the potential of the Axis to quickly reach Baku is promising, the mountainous terrain, strained logistics, and the lack of adequate equipment for the Turkish to arm their soldiers would mean that a quick seizure of Baku would be improbable. And even if they were to reach Baku, it's likely that the Soviets would have destroyed the oil fields prior to the invasion, leaving both the Soviets and the Germans starved of oil. With the destruction of the Baku oil fields, and the overextended Germans fighting in the Levant and Eastern Europe, the Allies would eventually manage their invasions. Just like in our timeline, the Allies would perform invasions in Northern Africa, France, and Italy, eventually leading to the Axis defeat. However, in this timeline, they would also need to invade Turkey, both from their land front in the Levant and a naval invasion into Anatolia. While the Yalta Conference had clearly outlined the Allies' intentions regarding the occupation of Germany and the distribution of spheres of influence in Europe between the capitalist and communist nations, there would be a significant amount of extra tension with the fate of Turkey to consider. The Allies have wanted to reintroduce the sort of borders that they had been hoping for in the original Treaty of Sèvres, with an international straits zone to allow access between the Mediterranean and Black Seas for all nations. However, Stalin would desperately seize the straits for himself, even diverting more troops from the Soviet-German front lines in order to facilitate such a seizure. His hope would be that if he were able to take control of the straits, he would be able to secure it for communism. It could even be that the Soviets don't even capture Berlin, leaving the Soviet-Polish state as the primary buffer of the Eastern and Western worlds. This then leads to a north-south split Greece and Turkey. The southern Greek state would be given their claimed lands in Anatolia, as stipulated by the Treaty of Sèvres. The Armenian Socialist Republic would be expanded, and all remaining land occupied by the communists would be turned into Soviet puppet states, with the aim to inspire anti-imperialist resistance in the Allied occupational zones, in securing the Bosphorus for the Comintern. The West would separate the Kurdish lands as an independent republic as a means to instigate conflict in the newly annexed Soviet lands, leaving only a small sliver of land for the Allies to establish a rival democratic government. However, this puppet government would not be a republic, but instead a constitutional empire, with the Osmans being restored as constitutional monarchs. While it may be easy to assume that this Turkey would want to continue the modernization model of Ataturk, Ataturk's legacy would forever be tarnished by his successor and his alignment to the Axis. The era of the Turkish Republic would be stained by their commitments to the Axis, as Ataturk would be considered a proto-fascist, leading to any replication of the modernization movements to be akin to fascism. Re-establishing the Ottoman Empire would avoid the tarnished legacy of Ataturk, but would also play into the hands of the communists, as the actions of the Allies in their supervised state would prove that the capitalists are inherently regressive. With the Soviets' access to the Mediterranean, more communist support will be diverted to the Middle East. This would pave the way for the Soviets to directly support communist and socialist movements there, potentially affecting the outcome of this alternate Cold War to a significant Soviet advantage. The exact ramifications of this are far too difficult to speculate, so with that, I end my speculation here. And with that, the video's over. Thank you so much for watching, and to Rewriting History for agreeing to collaborate. I had a lot of fun making this video, and I hope you enjoyed watching. If you haven't already, check out Rewriting History's video on a Turkish entry to the Allies. Will a Turkish entry to the Allies guarantee a brighter world? Or will Turkey suffer a similar fate like this timeline? I actually have no idea, I haven't seen it yet, but you should.
Bye-bye.